So welcome back, everybody, after your break. Welcome to our last two sessions of the afternoon, and I'm pleased and very privileged to chair the first of these. Chairs often begin, don't they, by saying so-and-so needs no introduction, and it's absolutely true in this case, because if there is anybody out there that didn't know Michael Carter before yesterday, then they certainly do now. So he really does need no introduction. But can I first of all add my thanks to those that have been expressed already by other panelists. Michael has truly been the inspiration behind this conference and has worked tirelessly to bring it to fruition. Michael, as he's probably already said, is a senior properties historian with English Heritage. What he hasn't said is that he is the author of numerous articles and papers, an ever-growing list of articles and papers on all forms of visual culture of medieval Cistercians, manuscripts, textiles, sculpture, metalwork, architecture, and fruition of this so far is this book, this wonderful book, The Art and Architecture of the Cistercians in Northern England, circa 1300 to 1540, published in 2019 in the series Medieval Monastic Studies. So I commend that to you. And there you are, you can see the cover of it. But you don't really want to listen to my voice any longer. We're all eager to hear Michael talking about our Aelred, a Revo interpretation for 2021. So Michael, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the warmth of that introduction, Janet. Let's hope the technology works for me. I think I showed earlier that it's not one of my strong points. Anyway, I think the papers we've been listening to over the past 2 days have really demonstrated Aelred's importance during the Middle Ages and indeed beyond, at Revo and elsewhere. Now, COVID means we had to reschedule this event from a conference to be held in Leeds in late July last year. It's now a virtual event. But what better time, though? We made a virtue of this by holding it to coincide with Aelred's feast. And I guess that being online and free, it would have been very much in keeping with Aelred's ethos of charity. But in actual fact, the conference is just a scholarly adjunct to an English heritage interpretation on site at Revo, whose beautiful rules you can see there. It's this interpretation trail or tour that we're calling it. And it's going to be long delayed, but it's going to be installed this spring. And it will, I think, leave visitors to Revo with a much better understanding of Aelred and his legacy. So why are we doing this? Where did the idea come from, and why the name Our Aelred? Well, English Heritage has been making a real effort to tell what could be called hidden histories, the hidden histories of our sites. And that includes stories of individuals that have been overlooked or neglected aspects of their stories. For instance, women's history, Black history, and LGBTQ history. Now, Aelred's name has been mentioned in relation to the latter. And there's going to be a round table discussion looking at this in more detail later. It's a very, very complicated aspect of Aelred studies. And I think if we just focused on that aspect of Aelred in an interpretation, we wouldn't have been doing justice to his wider importance. So we've decided to set this examination within a very broadly based scheme of a site interpretation scheme, we're sort of calling it, that makes accessible for modern audiences many of the themes we've been discussing here today. Now, Aelred's most important and enduring physical legacy is Revo Abbey itself. So we're using the buildings to tell Aelred's story. And indeed, many of those buildings, as we've heard, bear Aelred's imprint. Now, these panels that I've been talking about have been strategically located around the monastery, each one exploring how that particular part of Revo illuminates Aelred's story, significance, and impact. Now, their location is shown here on this slide, and I'll just briefly run through them. We've got the at the entrance. Number one is the entrance to the site. If you go up to number 2, that's the church. It goes then into the nave, the west range, the north alley of the cloister, the book room and library, the chapter house, warming house, novices chamber, Aelred's house, and it continues into the museum. Now, the interpretation, like the conference, is called Our Aelred. Well, why? Well, that's how he was referred to by his own monks. Well, at least in the English translation of the Walter Daniels Life of Aelred. But I think it's a description that really gets over his importance to Revo and his bond, his fraternal bond with his brother monks. And it's also slightly tongue. You might be able, the eagle-eared might be able, these eagle-eared, is that, yeah, the sharp-eared amongst you might be able to detect traces of a Yorkshire accent. And to this day, our remains in Northern English dialect an affectionate term used to describe a close family member. Now, Aelred was partly defined by his northern identity, and he did indeed have a very, very strong bond with his monastic family. Now, the first panel I'm showing there near the entrance of the site, it introduces the man, his vision of monasticism, his impact and legacy. And each panel includes a contemporaneous quote, either by Aelred himself or more usually from Walter Daniel, that addresses the theme of the panel. And we've tried to use a contemporary image as well, ideally from a Cistercian source, or where that isn't possible, another monastic source, to give a bit of colour to help people visualise, as well as the remains that we're talking about, other aspects of medieval material and artistic culture. Moving up to the church, we move on to the east end of the church, and that focuses on Aelred the Saint. There's a focus on what you can see, the architecture, the magnificent architecture of the East End, built in the early 13th century as a fitting setting for Aelred's relics and long-lost shrine. And there's also a comment there about giving his wider significance about the girdle or belt of St. Aelred, kept at the monastery and lent to women in their confinement. And it ends with a reminder that Aelred did indeed have his own feast day, that this was a place where the liturgy was celebrated. And it would have been celebrated by the Revo monks with some ceremony, and also it's still a holy day to this day. It's then down to the nave, built during Aelred's abbacy. We wanted to emphasise how the church's large size was necessary to accommodate Revo's enormous community. It's also an opportunity to talk about Aelred's vision of monasticism. In this particular instance, aesthetics, no colour, no pictures, nothing of great value, as he says himself. And we also just touch upon the fact of, as Alexandra was talking about, some of his artistic influences and also how well-travelled he was. Then it's on to the West Range and the lay brothers. This explains who they were. And I've always find this a very, very challenging task in a short interpretation panel to get across quite who the lay brothers were and what they did. And to show also how they were an integral part of the Revo community under Aelred. And we end with a description of one of Aelred's miracles, and this time the healing of the broken arm of a lay brother of Reesby, using the abbot's crozier, a symbol of his monastic office. The tour then moves into the cloister. The text explains that this was built by Aelred and how it was a place of tranquility and beauty, an expression of Aelred's monastic vision, eternal love and spiritual contentment. And the quote that's there from the Mirror of Charity, now no matter how many times I read that, it always sends a shiver down my spine. And when I'm standing in the cloister at Revo and I think about it, even in the monastery's current ruined condition, it is still a description which I think resonates to this day. We end the panel by mentioning Aelred's most famous work, On Spiritual Friendship. Now, you can buy a copy of the gift shop at Revo, and I'm sure English Heritage Retail will thank me for mentioning this. So when you all visit Revo, if you can, after the lockdown is lifted and the site reopens, please do buy a copy there. And on the subject of books, it's the book room and the library. The subject is Aelred the author. I hope the panel gives a sense of the scope and importance of his works and their presence in the library at Revo in the Middle Ages. The illustration I'm using there is from a manuscript that includes copies of his work from Swine's Head. It's not in the interpretation, but I couldn't find a decent photograph of the book covered, I'm afraid. So I thought I'd brighten it up with a manuscript. But we end on a melancholy note, I think, giving a sense of just how much has been lost from the Abbey. I think just one of the 22, only 22 books survived from Revo. That's actually quite good for an English monastery, to be perfectly honest. But if you think at the end of the 12th century, there were already close on 400 manuscripts in the Revo Abbey. And by the time of the Abbey's suppression, there would have been well in excess of 1,000 or more manuscripts and printed books there. It just gives a sense of the loss and how much we have lost of Aelred's works as well. For instance, his letters were extant at Revo into the 15th century, and they have gone. The next stop is the chapter house, one of the buildings that, oh gosh, what's happened there? The next stop is the chapter house. It's one of the buildings that dates to Aelred's abbacy. Now, it's a remarkable plan. You can see number 7 on the plan there. It was without precedent in medieval England and was inspired by early Christian churches in Rome that Aelred had probably seen as a place of cult and sanctity. Direct visitors there to the existing site panel installed 5 or so years ago, which explains all these points, also highlighting the reconstructed remains of the 13th century shrine of Abbot William, the saintly, the venerable, the Abbot William. It was under him that Aelred entered the community, and William nurtured his remarkable talents. Next, it's the warming room. Well, could you really imagine being a 12th century Cistercian monk and the hardships which Aelred describes in his guide for novices? How much monks gave up to attain their spiritual contentment. It involved genuine physical hardship and sacrifice and discomfort. But I also think there's still a message there that resonates with people today, that consumption and materialism do not make you happy, that you have to find something else within you to attain some kind of true happiness. And I think that's one of the things that resonates with Revo, that it has been a place of the human spirit throughout its existence, the great monastery, the inspiration for antiquarians and artists, and today as a place of spiritual nourishment, however you want to define that, for people escaping their day-to-day lives. We then move on to the site of the abbot, of the novices' house. It's number 9 on the plan. And we talk about how Aelred nurtured monastic life at Revo, especially through his care of novices. And we introduce here one of his best works, The Mirror of Charity, called, I think, by Walter Daniel, his contemporary biographer, as the best of all his works. Aelred is an especially sympathetic monastic leader. And that's because he comes across as so human and so empathetic. He understood what made people tick, our physical and emotional needs, and also our temptations. And this panel here provided an opportunity to raise the question about his sexuality, which is going to be discussed in more detail presently. Now, I hope if you've had time to scan the text, that we do approach this frankly, but we also acknowledge the limitations of the evidence. And we set discussion of Aelred's sexuality within a monastic context, making clear the importance to Aelred and his brother monks of chastity and adherence to vows. Now, the final stop on the trail around the monastery is Aelred's house, where he was granted permission by the Cistercian General Chapter to live because of his ailments. And it is here that we focus on his last years, his sufferings, so movingly described by Walter Daniel, his love for Christ and his continuing nurturing of his brethren, his death and his almost immediate signs of sanctity. I hope that if you read the final sentence, you'll endorse my heartfelt words about Aelred, and also, I hope, identify with them. Now, we then don't, as I said, we're going to direct people on to the museum, and we've seen the great architecture of the abbey, which is, you know, the most tangible physical evidence of Aelred. But there's also in the museum, which was recently equipped, set out about 5-6 years ago, some artifacts as well, which we can, via which we can tell his story. There's a fragment of an arch through which Aelred would undoubtedly have walked, probably daily. There are book fittings recovered from excavations, a reminder of his role as an author. There's a jug recovered from the main monastic latrine drain, likely used to collect urine. And that's been used to connect with Walter Daniel's descriptions of the saint passing kidney stones the size of beans rather. And then, gosh, could you imagine bees? Gosh, the beans would have been bad enough. And then we have the image of I got the scourge there. I deliberately highlighted that. It's the best, I think, preserved medieval example from anywhere in Europe. And it gives a sense of the self-mortification, the lengths that Aelred and his brothers went to suppress or calm the desires of the flesh in their quest to attain spiritual contentment. And in the lower right of the slide, the image above, you can see a fragment of the shrine of St. William. It's inscribed with St. William Abbot, the saintly and venerable he's described in Walter Daniel's biography of Aelred. And we end with this panel. It's positioned close to a window through which you can see the magnificent east end of the church. In some sense, it really does represent the end, the destruction of Aelred's shrine and the dissolution and wrecking of the abbey in 1538. But it's also a reminder of Aelred's lasting legacy. And part of that legacy we'll be discussing immediately after this. Before I conclude this talk, and in Aelred's spirit of friendship and community, I'd like to emphasize that I've been speaking now on behalf of a team. This installation's been well over a year in planning, and I'm just going to name check some wonderful colleagues at English Heritage who've made this possible. That's Nick Collinson, the interpretation manager, Susan Harrison, the curator of archaeology, Mark Douglas and Sally Wilson, the properties curators. It's thanks to them that Revo still stands up. And Tuka Lasko and his team at the Abbey, who keep alive the tradition of hospitality established in Aelred's time. I'm sure you'd want to join me in thanking them for their hard work and dedication. And I think we've all done our Aelred proud. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I should have checked with you, Michael. Do you want to take any questions or comments now, or would you like to go straight into the panel?
We go straight into the panel, and people are very welcome. If there's anything in the panel that occurs to them, there's a big session for discussion in the panel. You can go to.
Okay, well, before we move to that, can I thank you on behalf of everybody and thank your colleagues as well. That was wonderful. I actually, knowing Revo as well as I do, found it actually quite emotional to be walking around there and seeing how Aelred story is being told now. So thank you again. And I'll hand over to whoever is chairing, but round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dominique, are you there, Dominique? You were waiting.
I am. I'm here. I don't know if there's any sort of technical things that you need me to do. In terms, I don't know how to highlight people's videos or anything like that, so I'm just going to not. Thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see so many people and so many friendly faces. I'm particularly thinking of Richard O'Leary, who it's always a pleasure to see. So I'm going to do introductions, and I think then we're going to go into the panel. Michael, is there any sort of housekeeping notices that you'd like to cover in advance of that?
It's just that when it comes to the Q&A session, there is a Q&A button at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, the icon panel at the bottom. And you type them in there. Any questions, people? Hopefully, you'll be able to see them, Dominique. You should be as a host, not on. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
I should be able to, well, hopefully, we'll see that. So I'm just going to do introductions, and I guess please do start typing your questions in the Q&A as soon as you have them, and I'll filter them through to the speakers. So the first person on our panel is Professor Marcia Dutton, who received her PhD in medieval English literature from the University of Michigan with a dissertation on the 2 English translations of Aelred's De Institutione Inclusarum. She's been writing about the thought of Elrid and other 12th century Cistercian writers ever since, having edited the English translation of 4 volumes of Aelred's works, as well as the Brill Companion to Aelred, and published around 50 articles and book chapters on Cistercian subjects. She is at work on the critical edition of the sermons of Gilbert of Hoyland and the Song of Songs for Corpus Christianorum. She's currently the executive editor of Cistercian publications. Dr. Catherine Harvey is another panelist. She's a research fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, and has published extensively on the medieval clergy. Her book, The Fires of Lust, Sex in the Middle Ages, will be published by Reekton later this year, and she's also working on a book about the episcopal body in medieval England for Oxford University Press. Reverend Richard Coles co-presents BBC Radio 4's Saturday Live and BBC One's The Big Painting Challenge. He's a regular contributor to panel shows like QI, Would I Lie to You, Have I Got News for You, and he is the parish priest of St. Mary's Church, Findon. Dr. Richard O'Leary is the coordinator of Northern Ireland's LGBT Heritage Project. He co-founded in 2007 the Irish Anglican pro-LGBT group Changing Attitude Ireland. A recovering academic, he was previously lecturer in sociology at Queen's University Belfast and a prize research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. Abandoning statistical modeling for the archives, he embraced performance storytelling. His particular interest in true fairy stories includes storytelling about faith and sexuality. His solo shows include There's a Bishop in My Bedroom, 2017, at the Mac Theatre in Belfast. And finally, Michael Carter. Dr. Michael Carter, as you all heard, is a senior historian at English Heritage and was previously an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Courtauld. So this roundtable will explore Elrid's, I guess, current status within the LGBTQ faith community and explore both his contemporary relevance, his historical importance, and I guess the challenges and opportunities posed by queer approaches to historical and archival evidence. I guess I'll start by asking Michael if he has anything that he'd like to add, or maybe the first question to pose for us to be thinking about.
First of all, it's how do we ask the question, recognizing we are dealing with somebody who lived, gosh, 800 and something years ago, and bearing in mind what medieval evidence is likely to tell us and not tell us. And, you know, it is a question that has now entered the scholarly discourse and also has gained a lot of cultural capital, and he's become a very, very important, dare I say, inspirational figure for a lot of LGBT people, and including especially Christians. And, you know, it's something there, and it's how we are going to approach it. So lots of big questions to throw in to start off with there. And I will now shut up and let you answer all the difficult questions.
I wonder, Richard, do you, Richard, I guess Richard O'Leary, I'll ask first. And I guess, have you had any sort of, what are your encounters, if any, with Elrid and your sort of perspective on this?
That's a good place to start, because even though I did do history as an undergraduate, that wasn't how I encountered St. Aelred. I was brought up as a Southern Irish Catholic, and I moved to Belfast in 1988. Fell in love with an Ulster Protestant, and was surprised to find that among his selection of LGBT literature was this publication. I'm not sure how many of you know of it, but it's a little booklet produced by the Australian Catholic Truth Society. It was first published in 1975, and it's called Homosexuals, ! Letters to Aelred, written by a Jesuit priest, Desmond O'Connor. Now, this is relevant because later when I read Boswell's Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality, who talks about Aelred, he doesn't reference this publication. And what's pretty interesting about this is it has the imprimatur of the Archbishop of Melbourne and passes the censor, but it tells us that this Jesuit priest had been receiving letters from persons who he describes as homosexual in his capacity as editor of the Catholic Messenger magazine. And he said that I decided to write about this subject, and to do so in the form of letters to an imaginary homosexual man. And he says, trying to think of a name for my imaginary correspondent, I was confronted with the fact that every name that occurred to me might have been a cause of embarrassment to someone. So I called him Aelred. In the first place, I have never known a man with this name, nor do I expect to. But also, of course, he was aware of the writings of St. Aelred. And if you turn then to page 26, he tells us, a homosexual saint, that's a tough one. We know of saints who had been adulterers, fornicators, murderers. But have we any saint who had that psychogenic connection that we call homosexual? I think we have, and he's a very lovable saint too. You may be glad to learn that he was an Englishman and not one of those foreign types. He was one of those clean-cut, handsome, blue-eyed youths whom novelists like to portray as exemplifying the perfect Englishman. So this Jesuit priest, who I should say is not gay affirming because he emphasizes celibacy, but he offered in 75 St. Aelred as someone that people who he described as male and female homosexuals could relate to. And even though it's a conservative publication, it does establish that gay people can have a spirituality. And in 1989, that was quite a positive experience for me, even if unusually I found it in the home of an Ulster Protestant. Thank you.
So would anyone like to jump in there? Richard? Yeah, please.
Kind of parallel experience for me to Richard Cole's with Richard O'Leary, and that I first encountered, I had two encounters with Aelred really. The first was as a writer, and a translation which had actually been photocopied and bound in-house in a Benedictine monastery. Here's St. Benedict, by the way. Was given to me by the abbot of that monastery when I was thinking about becoming a Benedictine monk, and the issue of my own sexuality had come up, and we'd had a discussion around that. And the nearest the abbot was able to get to that in terms of coming alongside was to press into my hand this photocopied copy translation of Spiritual Friendship. And I think, as Richard O'Leary said, there's a kind of version of what we were talking about that was sort of palatable to orthodoxy, if you see what I mean. That Aelred was being offered as someone in whom the love that can exist between two people of the same sex need not necessarily conflict with the strictest standards of orthodoxy. Wasn't really doing it for me, but I think that was an interesting way to open the door, if you see what I mean. My encounter with him later became when I actually did end up living for 2 years in a monastery in Yorkshire, not very far from Revo, actually an Anglican monastic foundation, the Community of the Resurrection, where understanding a little bit more about the febrile atmosphere of the cloister and male homosexuality cheerfully and sometimes cheerlessly experienced in a community of people vowed to live a celibate life was endlessly captivating.
My work with Elrid has all been not in terms of anything about his own sexual identity, but rather what he says on a lot of subjects, including what he says about sex. And I'm always interested when people say that they came to him not by reading him, but by reading what somebody else has written about him. Because one of the things that has struck me from the beginning with his works is his very firm condemnation of sex outside marriage. Doesn't matter. He's equally clear about whether it's same-sex or opposite-sex relationship, because he acknowledges both, but he constantly points to the necessity of marriage. Now, I was saying the other day to Dominique and some of the others that I'm reminded, I grew up in 1940s and 1950s, and to some extent, this is exactly the position of the 1940s and 50s that I knew. We didn't talk about homosexuality, about gay relations. We were not even aware when I was growing up. But what we did know was that sex outside marriage was wrong. Now, obviously, that perspective has changed a lot in the last, I don't know what, 20, 30, 40 years. But what's interesting is that that is exactly Aelred's position. He talks about kisses as valued within marriage, but he is unhesitantly critical of sex outside marriage. So what we might say in today's world is that presumably, if in the world of same-sex marriages, then that might mean that he would be entirely supportive. But he doesn't talk about that, of course, so I can't actually speak to that. I have been concerned about the issue because I'm concerned about appropriation, about suggesting that, oh good, Elrid was gay, Elrid supported gay relationships, therefore he's a very good guide for gay people, but then excluding the way in which what he says is equally valid for straight people. And I think that he would be quite shocked to be understood as an advocate for LGBT relationships because, well, let's say because in the 12th century, that wasn't actually appropriate. And his criticism of it is quite clear. I think that it's the wrong question. I think that to talk in terms of his own sexual identity misses the point of what he says on every other subject. And I think that his condemnation of sex outside marriage makes him an awkward advocate for LGBT. I would prefer, how do I say this? I would prefer not to place so much emphasis on the hypothetical sexual identity of someone who lived 800 years ago as a way of justifying my own sexual identity. I would prefer not to have anything I wrote be read carefully to find out what my sexual identity was, what I fantasized about, what I wished for, what I experienced. And so everything I know about Elrid suggests that he needs to be taken in a broader way, and that saying, aha, we found one, is a dangerous approach to his life and to his work. I would also say, and this is something I'd said I would talk about, it's important to remember that Mary was a core icon for Cistercians. Not, however, so much for her virginity as for her obedience and humility. And Elrid says that at the purification, for example, she didn't need to be purified because of childbirth, but she did it out of humility and out of obedience. So you have an interesting thing where a Cistercian abbot in the 12th century is in an order that is very much defined by devotion to the Virgin Mary. And I think that has to be taken into account as well. Although again, not in terms of sexuality, but in terms of obedience and humility. So that probably enters into it.
Michael?
I was just looking for Catherine's having difficulty.
Catherine's, she's got my name attached to her, but she's definitely there.
I think I'm here now, am I? Yeah,
you are.
You are, hurrah.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you have something that you'd like to contribute?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, because I was having issues, I did miss the beginning of what some people said. So, yeah. I mean, I first heard of Elred actually by going to Revo, but then I suppose after that, I've come to him like Marcia, more from an academic perspective, reading Walter Daniel's life, and I suppose more generally, my perspective is that of somebody who works on clerical sexuality more broadly in the Middle Ages, and in fact sexuality more generally now. And so probably I share some of Marcia's reservations, but probably from a slightly different perspective. In terms of, this was a world in which sex was conceptualized so differently to how it is now. And that means that, yeah, we can't really identify anybody definitely as gay, but we can't definitely identify anybody as straight either. And I think that's a very important point to remember. But yeah, this was a world in which basically, anything other than missionary position reproductive sex between a man and his wife was a sin. And so the idea of sodomy is very dominant within the monastery. The idea of virginity is very dominant. And I think the dominance of that idea of virginity makes it very difficult to identify anything about an individual cleric's sexuality from their writings, because they have got the tendency to talk as if any sort of even impure thoughts is a terrible, terrible sin. Benedict Ward, writing about Anselm, has got a memorable phrase about him sort of writing as if he led this rake's progress of a life through Beck. And so, it's very difficult to know terrible things, what they mean. And so, as I say, it's a different mindset, it's a different world. We talked the other night when we were talking about this beforehand about, some of the letters that have been used to sort of identify people like Anselm, Elred's contemporary, as gay by Boswell. And again, the register has changed so much that those letters seem really suggestive of sexual bonds between men to a 21st century reader in a way that maybe in the 12th century they weren't, when you compare them to the sorts of prayers they were writing. So yes, sort of within that broader context, yeah, I too have my doubts about it from a medieval perspective. Let's say that.
I want Richard, please.
It's very interesting. Can you hear it? Yeah. Hold on to it. Yeah. I think it's very interesting. And of course, I think the sex lives of monks in the early Middle Ages are mysterious. Fortunately, the sex lives of monks today are also, fortunately, mysterious, I think. But they did have them. And I sometimes wonder if, while it's quite proper not to garland the past with the kind of weeds of the present and try to interpret through the prism of our own experience that's very distant from us in time and culture, Nonetheless, people did have sex lives. They did fantasize. They did have erotic components to their existence. And I think they may have built identity around them to some extent, not in the way that we do, but in some way. And this may be me entirely interpreting an ancient world through my own experience, but there is something about the cenobitic life, men committed to celibacy, living together, that might be an environment in which those identities do take on a particular shape that is lost because it's not something that's preserved in the literature. When I visit Revo, when I spend time with contemporary monastic communities, it's astonishing how much you feel is continuous with the experience of monastic communities in the Middle Ages. A lot of it isn't, of course, but a lot of it is. And so I wonder sometimes if it's just a bit too neat and tidy to disallow the question from the present of the past. What does it mean to try to interpret the life of Aelred as a figure who is relatable, horrible word, in some way, to LGBT people today? I feel it's a bit more of a grey area for me than it once was.
But I think, oh, sorry, Richard.
No, I'm done.
Richard.
Can I say that this point about the focus on his sexuality, I don't recognize that for this reason. You've had a 2-day conference and you've discussed many aspects of his life and his context, and we have one panel around his sexuality, which I think is an appropriate amount of engagement. So I don't think there's been exaggerated focus on his sexuality. Obviously, in the case of people who identify as heterosexual, including the medieval ages, insofar as we use that term, it's assumed. Secondly, I'll refer back again to 1988, where at that time I picked up a copy of the American Episcopal magazine for the LGBT group, Integrity. And that has a feature on St. Aelred from January 1988. And even then it makes reference to, this was after the American Episcopal Church adopted St. Aelred as a saint, said, after 800 years, and despite the temporary triumph of medieval scholasticism, narrow and distrustful view of sex, Aelred's acceptance and humanism. So I think we can also put back the question, are some medieval historians in the past and even now still uncomfortable with the area of sexuality as a focus of study, given in mind how much, and we know this very much from the Irish Church, where there was quite a lot of record of, the penalties that needed to be applied in monastic settings against same-sex sexual practice. So it certainly is a subject that needs to be on the agenda, irrespective of whether or not we introduce questions of identity. I noticed that neither Richard Coles or I actually, referred to Aelred as being gay in the way that, Boswell maybe controversially or provocatively did so in 1988 or 1980, bearing in mind that for those of us of that generation, even to get gay people acknowledged by the term gay, was quite a struggle, which may be why he overstepped the mark in his historical use of that term.
Marcia.
I just wanted to say, Richard Coles, I agree in the first place. I think relatable is a terrible word and I won't allow my students to use it. But I think, in fact, it's exactly the right, I think it's a way of talking about Aelred that is useful if we could come up with, a different word. One of the things that I've always been struck by is that everybody who reads Aelred finds him, identifies with him, because partly because he writes unusually for Cistercians. He writes about and for women as well as about and for men. His world is full, even though he's writing mostly monastic guidance and so on, his world is full of men and women, and in fact of attraction between men and women, between men and men, and between women and women. He doesn't close off aspects of the world in the way most of the others do. And so what that means is that we all see Elrid as being like us. And I'm not actually talking in terms of sexual identity right now. I'm saying I see him as thinking like me, as feeling like me, as reacting to the world like me. And I think other people go to him and find different aspects of him as similar, as in relationship. And I think that's one of the reasons, actually, that he, of course, seems of like someone who is supportive of all kinds of sexuality, of attitudes toward the world, of scholarship, of ordinary living. And I think that maybe that's a really good point of entry into Elrid, is to say, what is it about him that allows me to identify with him, or that allows you to identify with him? If we can remember always not to have that exclude the way other people identify with him. And that's where it becomes difficult, because there are people who so don't want to see him as like A or like B or like C that they start drawing lines. And my position has always been with Elrid that he is inclusive rather than exclusive, and that I don't want to see lines draw that say, no, he fits on this side of the divide as opposed to this side of the divide. And to be able to talk about him in those terms, the thing you just read, Richard O'Leary, from Integrity, suggests a kind of triumph, right? And I think that this triumphalism is dangerous in all aspects of the world. So I think, if we could, and I mean generally, think more in terms of what it is about Elrid that allows us to find ourselves in him and him in ourselves, that this could open up the conversation in a way that I think hasn't happened in the same way. So to allow that many of us in many different ways feel this sense of identification.
Can I ask you, Marcia, it's really interesting, but I wonder what it is that you think is that quality that Aelred has that makes him so a figure that to whom we attach that stuff so readily, whoever we are, wherever we're coming from. There is something about Aelred, isn't there, which does seem to be very distinctive. He is, again to use your word, relatable. It's hard to think of another monastic of that period who quite has that appeal. Although I think it's quite a recent thing, isn't it? I mean, as far as I know, Aelred was really thought of as a historian primarily until fairly recently. Why does his voice all of a sudden begin to ring and resonate for people now?
I would say once the spiritual works became, because he was read as a historian up through the 19th century, and because he had a very different political agenda and political purpose in those groups, then people didn't hear that voice of, Aelred the man, Aelred who is speaking personally, saying, okay, Evo, I'm writing to you. Okay, sister, I'm writing to you. And each time he borrows that Augustinian voice of, in my experience, all of a sudden we have relationship. And so there we get back to that idea of relatability. We get him establishing relationship so persuasively that people argue who Evo was, where he was a monk, how Aelred knew him, argue that the sister he's writing for must have been his own sister and must have been older than he was and must have, because he makes us believe in him. And I think that's really the answer. He makes us believe that he's talking to us, that he knows.
Our Aelred.
Yes, our Aelred, exactly.
I think there's also an issue with the fact that, the life of him written by Walter Daniel, he comes across as a rounded human being.
If you just
context that, the description of although it's quite, as you would expect, was on the verge of a work of hagiography and certainly a medieval saint's life, about him defiling, the sense that, just knowing that he had been sexually active before he entered Revo although it doesn't give any details of what precisely that was. And then also about how he still struggled with the temptations of the flesh, however you want to define that, when he became a monk. And I think that is something which you find it so rarely in that kind of literature. And also it's such a wonderful translation, that Life of Aelred, as well. And it has, I hope I won't embarrass you by saying it, Marcia, a very, very good introduction as well. And, you know, there's something that shines through that makes him someone you can identify with so closely. And, you know, it must have been apparent throughout the last 2 days, the incredible warmth which I feel towards Aelred, and the, I've unapologetically used words like, you know, inclusion and community, and if I had read as a teenage, a young gay man in Leeds, reading Aelred's work or knowing of some of the literature on him would have given me incredible comfort of feeling very much not part of a faith community at that time, precisely because of who I was. And that, I think, is that's a very, very important aspect of Aelred to me, that I can see something in his writings, even though it's historically dubious, or not historically dubious, but open to question. Sorry. Does Peter want to?
Can I add one or two comments? I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I've always felt the poverty of language surrounding love. For instance, the very famous one, which no one has mentioned yet, of the community of the community at Revo in the summer, sitting outside, and Elrid talks about his love of every one of them. My observation is there's a strange poverty in the English language about what love actually means. And I think that one of the fascinating things about Aelred is that he has a quirky side to him. For instance, the Colloquationes daily, which overran the regime and routine of the abbey, with people lying on his bed and listening to his discourses, is one that I like to think of in terms of the Italian separation of coffee. There are 16 or 17 different ways of describing coffee. In English, it's just the reverse. There's no way of separating out infatuation, affection, many other states of love, and this is one of the problems, I think, in, as everyone has said, in making this transition from whether or not there was a sexual component. One only has to think of the cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church. Cardinal McCarrick, for instance, booted out by Pope Francis and forbidden to contribute to the discussion. So I like to think of the unusual qualities in Aelred, beginning with the chapter house, or beginning with his own abbot's house, which it gives a little illustration of what memory really was to Aelred.
Thank you, Peter. We have a question in the chat that Amelia sent through, which I think is quite interesting. And she says, you know, I'll just draw your attention to it, but thinking about the, you know, the ways in which, I guess we think about Elrid in terms of a saint now and not sort of as a historical figure. He can be an LGBT figure or saint or icon. It's exactly the same in terms of medieval culture, their attitude to saints, where they were never sort of static, and their hagiography, nature, and descriptions have changed over the course of centuries. So as a saint, you know, is Aelred is allowed to have different characteristics now and then. And I think that that, of course, is a very important point as well. Richard Coles.
Yeah, as we were talking, I was thinking that we pin on Aelred our various concerns, but everyone pins on saints that are resonant for them, their concerns too. It occurs to me that Aelred is also patron saint of those who suffer from kidney stones, isn't he? You might be having a very different symposium if it was people who shared that condition today. But I think it's true, isn't it? Cometh the hour, cometh the saint. And there are saints in the pantheon who speak particularly loudly into particular moments, circumstances, needs perhaps, and it's Aelred's moment now.
Richard O'Leary.
Yeah, I think the way that some contemporary LGBT can relate to someone like Aelred is something which Michael referred to, and Richard Coles as well, in that he presents a character who is tender in his friendships, but is also homoerotic, and that's something that, you know, many of us can recognize, and perhaps gay men in particular could recognize that in a way that other men took a bit longer, maybe feel comfortable with that discourse. But I want to make a further point about the link between the medieval and the contemporary, and how I can recognize some of what Aelred's context is. And it's something actually that I presented in my play as a bishop in my bedroom, which was an autobiographical solo piece. And I chose to present it in that form rather than in some article submitted to a journal, because I'm actually speaking to you from a house called the Cloisters, which is the house, which was the home of my late partner, who was an Anglican clergyman. And in the play, I presented a public document because I'm also an archive activist. And that was a letter from his now retired Anglican bishop, which said that, you know, dear Mervyn, 19th of October 2007, I think that you will understand that permission to officiate to someone who has contracted a civil partnership would be problematic, as my judgment is that it would cause offence to a significant number of members of the Church of Ireland in the Diocese of Down and Dromore, and I would therefore not be in a position to offer you such permission. So Mervyn's bishop forbid him permission to officiate because we'd had civil partnership. And that reminds me of something that the historian Catherine Harvey has talked about, of how in the medieval period, there was a group of men who were not supposed to engage in any form of sexual activity, the medieval clergy. Well, in the 21st century, of course, that applies to all Catholic priests and gay, lesbian, Anglican clergy. And Catherine Harvey refers to medieval theologians were extremely worried by the potential pollution of the priestly body by involuntary nocturnal emissions of semen. Now, that medieval preoccupation with sex is something, of course, that we still have in the 21st century. So that my late partner wrote back to the bishop, the 10th of April 2008, and said, "Dear Bishop Harold, I wish to state that the daily medical treatment which I have been receiving for prostate cancer since September 2002, and which is continuous, is called total androgen blockade. In popular parlance, this might be described as chemical castration. My doctor would confirm that 5 years and more of this treatment would exclude the possibility of any physical dimension to relationship." But there you have it, 21st century, an Anglican clergyman is telling his bishop that he couldn't get it up for medical reasons. So this obsession with sexuality of theologians and the monastic leaders in the Middle Ages is something which is very much alive in the 21st century. And when Mervyn challenged the bishop to say, well, you're on record to say you're okay with clergy being gay, it's just the practice of homosexuality is your issue. And yet when Mervyn says, look, I'm giving you evidence, I can't practice being a homosexual in the terms that you narrowly describe in terms of sexual intercourse, it still isn't enough to satisfy the conservatives. And that's where Aelred can still be relevant, because of course he blurs the lines between sexual practice and intimacy in a way that our conservative theologians are just obsessed with particular sexual acts.
I think it'd be interesting to get Catherine's perspective, actually, having just had her quoted, which is, on the medieval evidence you were just quoting there.
Yeah, I mean, I totally take your point about the fact this is not just history, is it? This is very much an ongoing issue for a lot of people, and I think it can be too easy as a historian to sort of just separate it up and go, this is the past and it's harmless. And no, I completely take that point. And I also think that the point sort of that Amelia made actually about the fact that we all project onto saints, and actually everybody's interpretation of Elrid is just that. It's an interpretation because none of us know him. He's been dead 800 years. So I think that's a very relevant point. And I also, and to go back to what Richard was saying earlier, I think absolutely this is something that we should be discussing. I'm skeptical about whether you can pin down individuals, but I think absolutely we should be talking about monastic sexuality in the Middle Ages. I think we should be considering, the harm some of these ideas did and continue to do. I think we should be considering also the way that a lot of this history has been covered up, and by historians very recently, by a lot of 19th century editors who would deliberately edit out any sorts of allusions to anything they felt was not proper. But also that it's something that has undoubtedly been left out of a lot of medieval records because it wasn't something that was proper. And I'm now about to make a comparison which is going to sound inflammatory in a way that I don't mean to, because I'm going to mention, I don't know if any of you have seen Diane Elliott's new book on clerical sexual abuse in the Middle Ages. Now, obviously, that's got nothing to do with sex between men, but one of the points she makes, I think, that is very relevant, is that it was very easily, in the same way as it is now, it was easier for them to cover up than it was, say, relationships with local women. And that means that often we don't know about it in the Middle Ages. And I think, we probably have to recognise that actually there was a lot of what we would now call gay history of the Middle Ages that just didn't get written down. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and uncover it and to try and find it where it did happen. It just means that, it wasn't celebrated in the way that maybe now we would like to feel that it should be. And do I think there's any harm in trying to read behind the lines and being open-minded? No. And as I said, I think you can't pinpoint anybody in the Middle Ages as gay, but we can't assume they're all straight either. That's as wrong to my mind.
That then raises a very interesting question for us at English Heritage, and it's good that we've got Dominique, who's the head of interpretation, on here. So this is where she's going to get put on the spot as well, is that I think this is the first time we have ever attempted to deal with an aspect of sexuality at all in, two brief sort of sections in panels. And how do you think, Dominique, and other participants, how do you think as an organisation, English Heritage, acknowledging that this is a legitimate aspect of how do we interpret our sites with the public? And, I think about there's an awful lot of negative evidence that we have from monastic visitation records about sexual behaviour of monks, and then especially lurid evidence from the suppression era, which we never ever mention. We just skate over. We never ever mention anything like this. But how are we going forward, having had the experience at Revo and now, how are you going to start to be doing this more proactively, or having it become more of a mainstream activity? And then I think as well, where appropriate, because I think what we've got right here is it is just one small aspect, and we have dealt with it in I think of quite a matter of fact way as well, rather than a big song and dances way, perhaps. Anyway, sorry, there we go.
I had to write down the question because it was tough. So really give me the hard one.
Oh, yeah, put me on the hard spot.
That's why I'm a big girl. I could take it. I think, I think that the first thing that every historian knows is that history isn't really about what you write about, it's what you don't write about. And the process of omission and selecting your evidence and that sort of thing is at the heart of the historical process. And visiting a heritage site and doing heritage interpretation is not the same as doing academic history writing. And we have very poor tools in the heritage sector to communicate nuance, to communicate multiple perspectives, alternative viewpoints, talk about the nature, the inherent bias that evidence provides, the nature of archival material. And I think that process of reading sources against the grain, sort of forcibly extracting the secrets that it doesn't, that the sources do not wish to give up because they were not intended to give them up, is a big challenge. And I think part of that is helping our visitors to understand that when they see something written on a panel, that it isn't the same thing as something etched into a stone held by Moses. History is a process. It is a series of arguments and discussions and conversations that take place over space and time. So that's sort of the first thing that I think is important, is that we're not very good at doing what we mainly do. I think that's one thing. The other thing is, I think sorry, Richard, Richard Cole, do you want to jump in?
No, when you're done.
The other thing I was going to say is that I think we need to be, the majority of the people of the world who've lived on Earth, we really don't know very much about them. I mean, I guess that's becoming more and more untrue as more people live today or on Facebook and that sort of thing. But once you start, heading into the past, it's pretty misty. And I think that it's about being honest as well about the limits of knowledge and where speculation begins. And I don't think when it comes to heritage interpretation that speculation is a bad thing. I think that we want people, that it's important to think about the past creatively and imaginatively, and to use the touchstones of evidence as frequently as possible, and to help people to understand the frameworks and the sort of the architecture, the scaffolding within which there is opportunity to be creative. And I think that this exhibition or this trail, hits on something which is a fact, not Aelred sexuality, but it is a fact that Aelred has special significance for LGBT Christians. That is a contemporary cultural phenomenon, and I think that we are at our best as a sector when we can demonstrate the relevance of the past to the present. And I don't think that requires Aelred the answer to the question, was he or wasn't he? Which is reductive, and again reduces us again as homosexuals to a series of sexual acts, which is the opposite of which sort of the thing everybody's been fighting for a long time. And but I think there's an impulse. There's always this impulse around that curiosity from me to try to find somebody who's like me. And that tends to get reduced to facts, because that kind of evidence where somebody says, geez, thank God I'm a gay, or oh no, please don't make me gay. We're not going to find that paper or that bit of parchment or somebody or that inscription anywhere. And so requiring this sort of specific kind of evidence, the secret coin, the secret handshake, isn't going to get us anywhere. But I think that understanding the nature of intimacy, understanding the nature of human interconnectedness, I think is enlightening, it's uplifting, and it's inspiring. And I think one of the worst things about queer history in particular is how much of it can be extracted from exclusively, or the evidence resides in penal and traumatic experiences for people. That's a real challenge for us, because you don't want to re-traumatize, use this sort of beat people over the head with historical trauma. And people have a right, I think, and want to explore and find their ancestors. The other thing is, I think, around this idea of chosen family and monastic communities themselves as chosen family, as sort of groups of people living in a community. It's an intentional community. It's a very not relevant term to that setting. I think there's something that's inherently compelling about that. And so these people came and they made lives together, and they built communities together, and they lived together. Whether or not they were having sex with each other is utterly beyond the point, but also right at the heart of it. So it's these contrasts that I think that are really challenging. But how we do this on site, you know, this is a step. We want to do more of it. It's important. Sorry, that's in for me. Richard, please.
No, you got to where I wanted you, where I was going to go. I think when I was in the monastery, the most persistent question from visitors, once they've relaxed.
So I want
Marcia's about to leave.
Sorry.
I'm not leaving out of being offended. It is that I have a conflict and I must go now to the other meeting. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you.
Marcia.
We knew about it. I swear she's
Thank you.
Richard Coles, and then we've got some questions that have come in from the questions, which are slightly long. So I may ask other people, you all, to read the question rather than have me read it out, annoying style. So Richard Coles, please.
Just when people visited us in the monastery, the question they really wanted to ask was, why did you do this? Why did you choose to come and form a life here in these extraordinary circumstances, which involve such a degree of sacrifice? And that might be a useful question to people who are coming to Revo and trying to understand what was happening there. Why did people do this? And one of the reasons they did it seems to me, and you picked up on it, Dominique, at the last part of your answer, was that they deliberately chose this life in order to flourish in some way, in order to form relationships that were kind of sturdy and rich, and gave them a sort of return that was useful and meaningful to them. And that, I mean, it's very tempting, isn't it, to think that if you were a homosexual man in a world which was hostile to that, in which you would need to be extremely careful about that data about yourself, how you might gravitate to somewhere like that, if only because other people would do so too.
I think Richard might be frozen, or I'm frozen.
No, sorry, I was just thinking.
No. So I just draw your attention to the questions. We have one from Brother Lazarus Graziadei. I don't know if I said that correctly. Can everybody see these, or are we just sort of staring at our screen open mouth while the people watch us?
No, people can't read them. It's only you.
Okay, so I'll read it out quickly, and you can all think about what you want to say. So as a pastor, there's an obligation to be, quote, be all things to all people. In a cloistered, celibate, same-sex environment, that can mean taking on both, quote, traditionally feminine and maternal, and masculine and paternal obligations to the flock, or to the nurturing of growth of all concerned. Aelred doesn't seem to shy away from this and takes very seriously his pastoral obligation, as evidenced in his beautiful pastoral prayer. Might this have been aided by an innate erotic attraction to men? Perhaps. And that could be an interesting argument for how homosexuality isn't necessarily a danger to, and in some cases might help a man or a woman in a cenobitic context when integrated in a mature way. Could it have been an integration and channeling of natural human erotic affection, regardless of orientation, towards a more universal love? It seems to be the main point. Love of the brothers and love of the place are Cistercian ideals, and Elrid undoubtedly displays these values regardless of sexuality. Sorry, I'm not an academic or Elrid scholar. You're very eloquent, though. Just an interested junior Cistercian monk who heard about this wonderful 2-day conference about this abbot. I've really enjoyed all the talks, and I've been able to join, and want to give a shout out to Marcia. Sorry, Marcia's gone. I'll forward it on. Who gave a wonderful talk on the Nun of Wotton when I was a novice. Thank you very much, Brother Lazarus. That was lovely. I think that's a really interesting point. And these notions of love, as I think as Peter Ferguson was mentioning, are of course very tied up with a kind of a reductive sense of love, whether that can be paternal, fraternal, maternal love, and with sort of genders attached to it. And I think our gendered understanding of relationships is also very interesting and obviously very different to the way in which I think the gendered world existed, certainly 800 years ago. I don't know if there's anybody that wants to say anything about that. Richard O'Leary.
Yeah, the point there made by the brother, I think it's something that can be found in that publication by the Australian Jesuit in 1975, because he very much emphasizes what he says is Aelred as the saint of friendship, homosexual friendship, if you like, and he emphasizes Aelred's let his sweetness descend on you. I suppose my personal issue with this publication, of course, is that it is in denial of the erotic expression of that, but it certainly emphasizes the positive, deep relationships which are evidence in Aelred's writings.
Thank you, Richard. Does anybody, it's 4 o'clock. We started a bit late. I'm happy to stick with the chat as long as there's chat to have. I just want to draw a note. Martin Prendergast very patiently has waited for me to talk about this. The LGBT Catholics Westminster, not so much a question, but a further reference. Brendan Callahan, SJ, a British Jesuit, has written gay-affirming articles on Aelred's spiritual friendship, including in The Way. There's a link here. It's to a website, which I think I'll ask maybe if anybody's interested, put something in the chat, or I'll try to copy and paste this into the chat.
I'll copy and paste it now.
Thank you, Michael. Any last things that anyone wants to discuss, or any final questions?
Or final thoughts, even.
Can I just say thank you to English Heritage and the Archaeological Association for broadening out the conference in a way that allows a discussion like this to take place. There aren't many opportunities for it to take place, certainly not in the more kind of conventional religious settings. And I know today when I posted on my project about St. Aelred, there was surprise, because he is not well known outside of maybe American Episcopal LGBT and maybe a small core. And I think that's probably a good thing for anyone who's interested in Elrid, that he becomes a little bit better known, at least starting off in Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Richard. It's always lovely to see you and have your wonderful show and tell be part of your presentation. It's one of my favorite things about having you at any conference. But your archive and your insight, I think, has been really helpful. I wasn't aware of Elrid until Michael came with the idea for the exhibition. That's my poor knowledge rather than anything else. But it's been really, I think, really lovely and really great to be able to do this exhibition and to do this this trail, confidently.
Right. I think that's probably done the round table. I'm going to hand over now to Julian Lutzford from the British Archaeological Association. Thanks so much again to everybody who participated in the roundtable, by the way. It's as Richard just said, I think it's something very new for us as an organization. And, we're finding our way in this of how to doing these minority histories, hidden histories, and we want to do it right. We want to do our best with it. And, I hope we made a good start with Aelred and with the conference today. And thank you so much for participating. Anyway, Julian, you've heard me going for all last 2 days, so let me hand over to somebody coherent. Thank you.
Well, Michael, can you hear me, by the way? Michael, can you? Yes, good. Michael, you just said something rather interesting. You suggest there might be more of this after Elrid, so we look forward to that. I mean, I'm really just here on behalf of the British Archaeological Association as its president to express gratitude to all speakers, panelists and chairs over the last 2 days, really just recapitulating what Richard just said. I think this last roundtable session that I've been in on has been really fruitful and explored interesting issues about how we deal with history as well as the headline topic itself. A lot of BAA members and doubtless EH members too will have benefited from that. And I was heartened to see that there were 90 participants or something, which is pretty good for this second afternoon. So thank you very much, everybody who's been involved. Thank you to Meg Bernstein, who's the webmaster for the BAA and who's helped a lot in facilitating this event. And special thanks to Michael Carter, of course, for his energy, enthusiasm and commitment to seeing this event through in pretty trying circumstances. And thanks for a view of your icons too, Michael. We've all enjoyed that. The BAA, I think, the British Archaeological Association, has benefited by this event as collectively as much as any individual has. And for that, collectively, I express its thanks. Michael came to us with this concept and running it online when it was not possible to do it face-to-face in the old-fashioned way. And it was readily taken up, and it's been a huge success. And so that's why I was interested to hear Michael moot the idea that there might be more to come, because we'd be very pleased in future collaboration. But thank you so much, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Julian. Right, well, thank you very much. The BAA posts proceedings online. I'm not quite sure what the proceedings are for that with Meg will know, but they normally go up fairly quickly. So if you missed anything or would like to listen to things again, they should be online. And I just leave by thanking everybody for tuning in over the last 2 days, to all the speakers for their fantastic papers, to people that have commented. And I hope that this event has provided some welcome diversion from the circumstances that are surrounding us, and that we've done our best over these last 2 days to make a virtue out of necessity. And I think what better way of brightening up this fairly grim January here in the UK than with Aelred. I think we've done him proud. So thank you very much. Really, really appreciate it. And I hope to see you all soon, and especially good to see you again, Richard.